Performance time, come on and run some tests. We're going to find a memory leak. I've got no friends but virtual users. Soak test never end, it's performance time. Hello and welcome to Performance Time. It's been quite a long time since my last video, and today I'm going to do a recap of the Neotys PAC conference, which was held in the island of Santorini in Greece just over a week ago, in fact. And I was lucky enough to attend and present, and I wanted to share with you what the key takeaways were for me and the talks that really got me thinking. Here's a photo of the group that were there. Unfortunately, and partly due to the coronavirus, there were many people who could not actually attend and present in person, so they presented via video chat, but I think there were seven speakers there. That's all that we could have, but it was still an extremely good event. I was very pleased with the caliber of the talks. And here is a beautiful picture of the Isle of Santorini when we went for a tour, which was the only real time I got to see the island, but it was beautiful. I did also get to see Athens for a few days before the event with my wife, and that was extraordinary. So I'm not going to talk about every talk. They were all great, but there were 5 talks which got me thinking, and so those are the ones that I want to talk about today. The first one is by my good friend Mr. Stijn Schepers from Belgium, who was the man who hired me for my first job over 12 years ago. And Stijn now lives in Europe again, not in New Zealand like he did back in those days. And he's a very good speaker, very charismatic. He opened up with some problems around how there is too much data out there, and it's very hard to interpret it or know what's important and what's not, and how to communicate to the right people at the right time. And one of the things that came up in this talk was this idea of synthetics. So anyone who doesn't know what synthetics are, they're essentially like an ongoing repeated test in production. Not always for performance reasons, but in his situation, he had set up a performance test that runs in production every single day. He created an acronym, I can't remember what it was. And so that was interesting, that there were organizations out there who are performance testing in production. I think there's a lot of merit to that in the right circumstances. He also showed some different visualizations, ways that we could very quickly identify changes in system behavior. And one of them was a percentile chart, which I recently reproduced and posted on LinkedIn. You basically have the response time on the y-axis, and along the x you have the percentiles, so from 0 to 100. So you kind of get this slope pattern, and if the system behavior changes, then the slope, you see a very clear change. I quite like that, and it got me thinking about different kinds of charts that we could use to identify changes in system behavior faster. He finished with a question around performance and how do we make it work in Agile, performance engineering and performance monitoring. And I don't think we had a clear answer to that question. It's been sort of an ongoing question, which is continued, and I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. The second talk that I wanted to talk about was from Andy Grabner from Neotys, who his talks SLA validation as self-service with Captain quality gates. So Captain is an open source tool which he has been working on for quite some time, and the basic idea is that you can set up quality gates for performance, whether that's for your performance testing or for production. And you do that by defining, first of all, you define the measurements you care about, SLIs. Then you define the targets that you're trying to achieve, or the SLOs. And then you connect to data and check. You're basically checking the SLIs against your SLOs and looking for pass or fail, or to assign some score to that. And there's the two use cases that he talked about in the talk were, the first one being to automate that SLI evaluation. Is our performance good enough? Does it meet these objectives that we set? And that's the one that sort of interests me the most. The second use case for Captain is performance testing as a service. So that would be, he was inspired by several people, but one of them was Mark Tomlinson, who set up at PayPal a system where developers could create a Jira ticket, which would essentially, where you could define which metrics you were interested in, and it would go ahead and automatically run a performance test and based on return the results of those metrics that you asked for. So that's one of the other use cases for Captain. And even with the automated SLI evaluation, the idea is that your developers and your architects or anyone else who doesn't have to be a performance tester can define the metrics they're interested in and define the objectives that they want to be met, and that gives them sort of it enables them to define performance requirements without having to involve a performance engineer. So I like that. And he did point out that the need for others to come in and build connectors to different data sources, and that is something that I am genuinely interested in doing. For example, the way that I use JMeter, I use the flexible file writer, not the default way of writing results. So I would need to create a connector to get that particular results format and provide an API that exposes that to Captain. So I thought it was a very good talk, very clear. I didn't necessarily understand Captain the previous time he talked about it, but this time it was really clear to me. The third talk that was interesting to me was by a new PAC member, Eduardo from Italy, measuring CPU throttling in containerized environments. And now I'm involved in a big program of work, and it's being built in containers. I understand conceptually what a container is. I don't have a lot of confidence around using them and monitoring them. And Eduardo had done a bunch of analysis around containers and this average CPU usage as a metric, and why it wasn't valuable, and how that comes down to, under the covers in Linux, each container has a CPU quota, which you don't necessarily, that's happening under the covers. And so he put together a case around that the best way to understand the CPU or the utilization of a container is looking at the throttle time, the percentage of throttle time. And that was interesting, and something that I'm going to need to build dashboards in the next few weeks around monitoring containers. And that's something that I'm going to implement in what I'm doing. So rather than just looking at average CPU usage, I'll be looking at percentage throttle time as well. And how you don't want no throttling time, because then you're probably massively overspeccing your environment. Fourth talk that was interesting for me, the most interesting for me anyway, was from Anchor Jane, another new Pac-Man. And so basically he was looking at how can we measure client-side or web performance without an APM tool. And there are some JavaScript libraries, what's it called, the user timing API, which the big players such as Google and Facebook are looking into and using. And he did a case study. He basically practically built a solution and gave it a go using these APIs, this API, in order to measure the user experience from that browser perspective, from that client perspective, and showed that it worked. And really the use case was if you maybe wanted to understand some basic customer experience, but you didn't want to invest in an APM tool. That would be one example. And he hadn't got to the point where he was using it in production, but I thought it was very interesting to hear what he built, and got me thinking about how could I use that, or how could I work with developers to use that user timing API for us to help understand what our client or user experience is. And this API, it's built into pretty much all the main browsers, and has been for a very long time, which I found very interesting. The last talk that I wanted to mention, it got me, I thought it was the best talk of the event, was from Ulrich. I don't know if I can pronounce his surname, who actually spoke at the very first PAC in Scotland and did a virtual PAC as well. But his talk on extreme performance testing was a case study about the time he had to do a 2 million concurrent user load test, which was pretty amazing for me, given that the most concurrency I've ever produced is, I think it's 3,000 threads, 3,000 users. And the reason he needed so many is that it was an application that was used for the TV program The Voice. People sing, and then people around the world vote, all in a moment in time. And so he needed to test what would happen if 2 million people voted within, I don't know, I can't remember, it was a 10-second period or a 1-second period. And he talked about this is a pretty unique requirement. Not many people are going to have this need. And he used Neoload, and he was unable, because he had one controller and 800 load generators across 4 different cloud providers. It's amazing. He was unable to use the test data built into Neoload because it was all coming from the controller. So the controller was just CPU completely blown out of the water because you had 800 load generators trying to get test data from it. So he had to build his own test data management, which is something that I've done for other reasons, and that was interesting to me. And also he'd run a test, and it took an hour and a half for the results to all come back. And it was interesting hearing about dealing with CDNs and DNS and not updating quick enough, and dealing with different IPs and different locations and making sure we simulate that accurately. And one of the things that is applicable to me is that I'm currently working a lot in AWS, and he mentioned that it's quite handy. AWS has custom templates where you can set up a template for your load generator, which has the configuration of Linux or Windows or whatever you want, along with JMeter, and for me it would be JMeter and OpenJDK and whatever other software you needed there, and configured all as a template. And you could just spin those up on demand. And that's something that I will be using in my work. And it got me, as a kind of side note, it got me thinking about this idea where, what if we removed the requirement for what we removed the responsibility of storing and accepting and storing results away from the load testing tool. And I had this idea about creating an API, a results API, and you call it just as an HTTP or an API call whenever you want, with a result sample, or maybe a group of result samples, and it would asynchronously store them in some database or some data store of your choice. I don't know if there's a requirement for that or a need for that, but it got me thinking. It's about something that we could do, especially for the really, really, really big load tests, where you don't necessarily want to have to wait to the end of the test and have all this data flowing back to a controller. If you were constantly sending results to some API, then you could be monitoring those results in real time, and there wouldn't be any challenges retrieving all the data at the end. So yeah, I thought it was a very good talk, and I found it very interesting. something that I probably will never experience being in New Zealand. I mean, the country only has 5 million people, and a 2 million user load test probably isn't going to happen. Yeah, so for me, all the talks were good, but those are the 5 talks that stood out in terms of the ideas were relevant or interesting to me at this time. And there were 4 key themes I took away from the conference. The first one is that in order for really, really great performance testing and engineering, or a lot of these ideas around automation and enablement and involving delivery teams, the only way you can get that to work is if your organization is changing, will change to accommodate that. I almost feel that we quite often get in a trap where we want to improve the way that performance testing is done, but you can't do that until the organization's ready to change or wants to change. And so I certainly feel sometimes my role changes. I'm doing a lot less hands-on practical work and a lot more trying to almost sell the idea of performance and promote a good practice, and almost in a way I've become a DevOps advocate without even thinking about it. So that was something that I thought about, and it seemed to come up continually. A lot of the other speakers were able to achieve a lot of things that seemed almost out of reach to me because of the kinds of organizations that they work in. The second common theme that came up continually was around synthetics and performance testing in production, which is something that for some reason I was really skeptical about at first. This idea of running synthetics and whether that was a valuable thing to do or not. I've definitely come around to the idea, why not? If you don't necessarily have users on your system all the time, you might have 3 hours when none of your customers go on, but you want to know during that time, is everything up and running and working correctly, and what does performance look like? The third thing was around this idea of automated analysis and quality gates. So in the very first PAC, I talked about the myth of continuous performance testing and the huge challenges around automated analysis. I don't think we have solved those problems at all, but we are getting closer to that point. And setting up things like Captain, understanding your SLIs and SLOs, and creating quality gates around them. This is a practical way that we can do that. But once again, you have to understand your system, and you have to have clearly defined SLOs. And that can be a challenge for organizations, just to even understand what's a meaningful objective. That can be the hard bit. But it's definitely something which many organizations are trying to tackle, which is, you need that to happen, right? Because in DevOps, we have this desire. I mean, every developer should be able to hit a button, check in their code, and it should just automatically be able to they need to get automatic feedback about everything related to the quality of that, including performance. So we need to find ways to give them that feedback immediately. Otherwise, we become the bottleneck, and I don't want that to happen. The last common theme, which has come up in previous PACs as well, is what is the role of performance in Agile, or DevOps, or continuous delivery, but particularly Agile. Performance is a specialist area. I mean, I've specialized for my entire career. How does a specialist fit within the Agile model when you have lots of delivery teams and they're self-contained? How do I work in those teams or outside of those teams? How do I prevent myself from being spread too thin? And what does it mean to be? There's this desire to have T-shaped staff. So you've got a deep specialization in a particular area, maybe performance, but we really need to start picking up these other skills along the top, whether that's automation and around the sort of DevOps, continuous delivery type world, whether that's about what I was just talking about with being able to convince people of what what needs to happen and what good performance looks like. Almost, what's the word? Being persuasive. That's a skill set which most performance testers and engineers probably don't have, given that we're mostly technical people who like to sit in a dark room somewhere solving problems. But it's important in the modern day in our organizations to get those changes happening. So that's another problem which hasn't been solved as such, but there are definitely some strong ideas out there about how we can go forward, and it definitely got me thinking about what my future is in my role and how I can add the most value and where's performance going. So overall, Neotys PAC was a fantastic experience. I'm looking forward to the blog posts that come out. It's a shame that the videos weren't recorded, but the guys with the cameras were stuck in Italy, unfortunately. So looking forward to the virtual PAC in 6 months. And as always, I'd be keen to hear if you have any thoughts around any of the topics that I talked about today. And I'll finish by saying thank you to Neotys and to all the speakers at the PAC for an awesome experience and for, I guess, revitalizing my interest in the realm of performance. Not that I wasn't interested, but it's definitely inspired me to the point that I want to talk today about this and continue to join the conversation. So I will see you guys next time.